The Punisher is a rare video game, and it's a rare video game that was made in 2005 and shares its spotlight with a lot of other early, 2000s video games, such as the likes of Max Payne 1 and 2, Hitman Contracts, 50 Cent Bulletproof, Manhunt 1 and 2, and such of games as Total Overdose. Now, this was the early 2000s of where third person shooters were very prominent and very numerous. If you didn't make a third person shooter in that time and age, or that era of the 6th gen era, you were pretty much missing out. And this was when PS2 was pretty much still at its peak. Now the PS2 came out in 2000, and to this day it still stands as one of the greatest consoles of all time, specifically spanning at how diverse and how many numerous games there were back then, being it movie tie-ins, anime, video games, the works. Now the Punisher game is sort of underrated and never really got its day, being very unappreciated of its time, but there being many controversies surrounding its content and surrounding what it stood for. Now this was the early 2000s of where people were used to blame everything on violent video games such as Grand Theft Auto, Max Payne, Manhunt, Street Fighter, Tekken. A lot of people were blaming things. This was the era. This was that era of people blaming video games for kids doing bad things, like kids getting into fights, stealing cars, doing very many numerous bad things. This was that era of the early 2000s of where, as opposed to parents just parenting their kids better, they just decided to blame violent video games, when the parents were the ones who really bought their kids the games. And you'd have a friend whose parents were more lenient, and then you'd go to his house and play the video games. But just let me continue. So the Punisher was a rare game at its time and was kind of unappreciated, and looking back at it now and comparing it to video games these days, it really even holds up today. The visuals are good, the gameplay is decent. But let me read up a little bit about it for you. It reads as follows. The Punisher is an action-adventure third-person shooter developed by Volition and published by THQ. It was released in 2005 for the Microsoft Windows, PlayStation 2 and Xbox. A mobile game was also developed by Amplified Games and released in 2004. The game stars the Marvel Comics anti-hero The Punisher. After his family was murdered by Mafia, Frank Castle devoted his life to the punishment of criminals. Players take control of the titular ruthless vigilante to track down and kill criminals. The game's story is a loose mixture of the 2004 film of the same name, as well as the Volume 5 and Volume 6 series of the comic books. Actor Thomas Jane reprises his role as Frank Castle, the Punisher. The game features many cameo appearances from Marvel Comics characters such as Iron Man, Nick Fury, Black Widow, Matt Murdock, Bushwhacker, Kingpin, and Bullseye. Also presents several characters from the Welcome Back Frank storyline, such as detectives Martin Soap and Molly Richfun, the Punisher's neighbor Joan and Spaker Dave, and Magnucci the Russian, and General Krieg Kopf. Now, this was a very cool game back in the day, and unfortunately I didn't get to finish it, but I only played it. But the thing was, at that time I was really young. This was 2005. I was still a baby, like a kid. I was still a kid at this time, and I couldn't understand the controls and really grasp the concept of video games back then. I just like to see them. I even struggled to play GTA San Andreas because I was so young and didn't know the controllers. But this game was really noticed because of how much gore and violence it had in it. There were many controversies and there were many things that they had to do to actually change the game. But let me read up a little bit about how people felt about the game and reception, and I'll read about the controversies later. The game received mixed reviews, criticizing the game's sound effect and the linear and repetitive gameplay, but praising its system of torture, the storyline, and the inordinate amount of violence and Punisher himself. Maxim contradictor Jen Newman opened his review the game made the Grand Theft Auto series look alike Super Mario. The Grand Theft Auto series look like Super Mario Kart, Detroit Free Race gave the Xbox version a score of 3 stars out of 4 and stated this isn't a game that requires a lot of skill, but if you can get past the gore, it is a rarity in the comic book world. A game that strays to the original work and doesn't stink. The Sydney Morning Herald, however, gave the game a score of 3 stars out of 5 and called it dark, violent, and derivative, but nowhere near as flawed as the movie. The game sold 1 million copies and was profitable for Volition. And Volition is one of the biggest game developers now, creating such games as Saints Row and the whole Saints Row series and many other various video games. And this game took a lot of influences from games from the early 2000s, that being such games as Max Payne 1 and 2, Hitman Contracts, 50 Cent Bulletproof, Manhunt 1 and 2, and such games as Total Overdose. The shooting mechanics, the third-person shooter, everything about this game screams not only generic, but it screams new. This game, when you play it, it would feel like home, but it would feel like something new. And that's what games like these days. You play a different game and it doesn't feel like home anymore. They change so much about the video games that you don't even recognize what exactly it is you're looking at. But let me continue. Now, this game was very gory for its time period. As I said before, it took the likes of games like Manhunt, of where you literally just murder people, and kill them in very many gruesome ways. But there was this torture system of where you'd use torture to get information out of people. And in the video games, Frank Castle only really did it to bad people, to gangsters, to crooked cops, or whatever you would say. He only ever did this to bad people and tortured them. But yeah, let me continue about the controversies of the video game. The Punisher features extremely gruesome scenes of torture and gore. The Ezra stated that an initial cut of the game would meet its adults-only rating. Much like Manhunt 2, the developers made slight censors to the deaths found with special interrogation scenes by rendering them in black and white in order to reduce their visual impact. The revised version was able to meet the mature rating. In the UK, the BBFC worked with THQ to further extend the solarization effect of the scenes, distancing the camera before the killings and adding a zoom effect during them, in order to pass with an 18 certificate, making The Punisher one of the only games to require BBFC cuts in order to be rated 18. In Australia, the ABC demanded similar cuts, including the removal of 2 scenes altogether. In Germany, the game was placed on the Federal Department of Media harmful to young persons. Now, as I said before, this was one of the eras of where parents would blame. This was one of the era where people would look for reasons to blame for people misbehaving and whatnot. And this was really the era of people blaming a child stealing a car or a bus or stealing a bicycle because of Grand Theft Auto. But honestly speaking, this game is probably very underrated and holds up pretty good by today's standards. The visuals aren't too bad, the gameplay is a bit clunky but pretty forgiving, and for a game of its time it was something brand new and fresh. But I didn't get to play this game that much because I was too young and didn't have that much hardware at the time. I didn't really have a PC, didn't really have a PS2. So I really missed out, and you really missed out too. I think there are certain places where you can get the game, or you can emulate it, or you can download it. But honestly, this game is something really crazy. Something I really miss the era of gaming. But my conclusion is that I really wish games would take a step back and look at what they've achieved with their older games. Because if old games play better than new games, it begs a question about what we're really playing in the first place. But this was a good video game, and the PS2 era was classic. But I don't really have much more to say about it. So this is the Chilly Man signing off. Thank you so much for watching. Peace out.